Hi everyone, this video is going to be a short one about tritone substitution. Tritone substitution is where you simply take a dominant 7 chord and you substitute it with another one, a tritone, or 3 tones away. Now a tritone can also be thought of as a flattened fifth or diminished fifth away. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a note of G, in fact here's a chord of G7, and a tritone away would be 1, 2, 3 tones away, giving me a D flat 7. Easier to think of it like this. Instead of playing the D flat here, you could play it here. So this is a flat 5 or diminished fifth. So I can substitute this chord with a D flat 7 here. Now, when might you do this? Well, the most common use for this would be over, say, a jazz chord progression like a typical 2-5-1. So in the key of C, you'd have the 2 chord, D minor 7, the 5 chord, G7, and then the 1 chord, C major 7. Okay, it's very common to take that G7 chord and substitute it with a chord, another dominant 7 chord, a tritone away, which is D flat 7. So if this is getting confusing, I recommend that you watch my videos all about music theory. I've done a whole course of these videos, and I talk about things like intervals, chord numbering, modes of the major scale and the melodic minor scale and its modes. Let's look at that chord progression a bit deeper now. So we've got D minor 7, the 2 chord. The 5 chord is G dominant 7, and then C major 7 is the 1 chord. What we can do with that G7 chord, especially when we're resolving to the 1 chord, is we can play altered chords. So G7 sharp 5, G7 flat 5, G7 flat 9, G7 sharp 9. These all sound kind of weird on their own, but the chords are only as weird as what comes after them. So for example, in the context of the progression, if I play G7 sharp 5 after the D minor 7, resolve on a C major chord, it sounds fine. I could do D minor 7, G7 flat 9, sounds weird on its own, but not if I resolve on a C major 7. So if you were soloing over the top of this, you'd be in the key of C, playing a C major scale mostly, until you get to that G altered chord, at which point you might want to do something like play G half whole diminished or G superlocrian. That would be my go-to. You could actually play G Phrygian dominant as well, but my go-to is G superlocrian, and that contains those alterations of those chords I showed you. Now let's do our new chord progression. So we're now going to substitute that G7 chord with a D flat 7. So we've got this. Now that sounds kind of smooth, and you could do that in a jazz song. You could see written down D minor 7, G7, C major 7, and instead of playing the G7, you could play a D flat 7 chord. And the reason it sounds so smooth is because, first of all, it's got this kind of chromaticism being notes all in a row. So I've got, say there, a D flat, and a C major 7. Our ears love that smooth transition between notes. Another example, I've got an F here, an F again here, and then down to an E here. So it's a very smooth change. Now, the other reason this works really well, and you might think D flat 7 has no resemblance to the key of C, and you'd be right. However, it's quite closely related to the G altered chord we had before. So if I play D flat 7, this note here happens to be the flat 5 relative to a note of G. If I look at this note here is an A flat. Well, that happens to be the flat 9 relative to this G here. So if I play the G7 flat 9, there's an A flat. In this chord, there's an A flat. Look at this note here in the chord. This is a note of B. Well, that's the major third from a G altered chord. If you look at this note here, this is an F. That's the flat 7 of a G altered chord. So actually all we've really done here is, although we've substituted our chord, we've not actually sacrificed much other than the root note of G. We've actually got a load of alterations, and that gives us that smooth, familiar sound. Now, what scales could we use over this? Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that I talk a lot about Mixolydian working over dominant 7 chords. However, in this case, D flat Mixolydian would sound so far removed from our key of C, it would sound a bit jarring. A better option would be to play Lydian flat 7. And I'll tell you why that works. It's because Lydian flat 7 is the 4th mode of A flat melodic minor. G superlocrian I talked about earlier is the 7th mode of A flat melodic minor. So actually they're all the same notes. G superlocrian and D flat Lydian dominant or Lydian flat 7 are the same notes. So let's see what this sounds like. I'll put in my looper here the original chord progression. I'll play a 2-5-1, and on the G I'll play some kind of alteration like G7 sharp 5. So D minor 7, G7 sharp 5, C major 7, and I'll play over the top, key of C, and then back to C major 7. Let's do that again. Key of C, G superlocking, and then back to C major. And here's our new chord progression: D minor 7, D flat 7, C major 7, and I'll play over that with the key of C. Sounds very similar. Now, where would you start with this kind of thing? I mean, you could go away and try and learn the scales across the whole neck, but it would take forever. You need some kind of starting point, and I always say in my other videos, use chords as landmarks to help you find what works. So pick, for example, a D flat 7 chord, and the first thing you could do is literally just play the chord. You could arpeggiate the chord, or you could arpeggiate like this: 1, 3rd, 5th, flat 7, back to the root. So there's a little arpeggio right there. You could play that. But then once you start to get familiar with this, you could then start adding the missing notes of the scale. And you could do this by literally learning the formula of the scale. So Lydian flat 7, you could learn that it's got a 1, a 2, a 3, a sharp 4, a 5, a 6, a flat 7, and then back to the root note. I wasn't thinking how to play a scale there, I was just thinking intervals. So I could literally improvise by taking the chord, maybe the arpeggio, and when I get more brave and I start to be familiar with that, I could then maybe add the sharp 4, or maybe the 9 or 2, sharp 4 again. And the great thing about that approach is I could take any D flat 7 chord that I know. I could take this one here, and I could literally arpeggiate the chord: 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 1, and just do that. And as I feel more brave, I can then add the missing intervals. I could add maybe the 1, the 2, the 3, the sharp 4, the 5, the 6, the flat 7, the 1. I could even do this, a little arpeggio, and then add the Lydianism, the sharp 4. By the way, that sharp 4, which is the same as a sharp 11, tells you that when you're playing these chords, you can play extensions of this D flat 7 chord, but you can't play the 11. It would have to be a sharp 11. You could play something like a D flat 9, that would be okay. You could play a D flat 13, but you would avoid playing an 11. You'd need a sharp 11. Anyway, I hope that video was useful to you. You'd be doing me a massive service if you could click like and subscribe. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.